Most people think cinnamon water is just a trendy detox drink, something you sip in the morning to feel a little lighter, a little cleaner, maybe a little more in control. But at the cellular level, cinnamon isn't simply a flavor. It behaves more like a metabolic signal, one that can influence how your body handles glucose, how strongly insulin has to work, how much inflammation quietly builds in your tissues, and how efficiently your mitochondria produce energy. And here's what almost no one talks about. The real impact of cinnamon water isn't about one dramatic change overnight. It's about a subtle shift in your internal chemistry that, repeated every morning, can compound into measurable differences. Cravings, energy, belly fat patterns, blood sugar stability, even markers linked to biological aging. So in this video, I'm going to show you what may actually happen in your body when you drink cinnamon water every morning. The benefits people get right, the claims people get wrong, the molecular pathways cinnamon can influence, and exactly how to use it safely, especially if you're over 50, pre-diabetic, or trying to improve metabolic health without extreme dieting. The morning myth versus the biological reality. Let's start with the myth. The myth is that cinnamon water burns fat like a stimulant, almost like it melts calories off your body the moment it touches your stomach. That's not how it works. The reality is more interesting and more powerful long term. Cinnamon water may help your body create a metabolic environment where fat loss becomes easier over time because your glucose spikes become smaller, your insulin signaling becomes calmer, and your inflammatory load can trend downward. And when those three things improve together, blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, and inflammation, your body often becomes more metabolically flexible. That means it can switch between burning glucose and burning fat with less friction. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. This is exactly why a simple morning ritual can matter more than people expect, especially after 40 or 50, when insulin sensitivity naturally declines and low-grade inflammation tends to creep up without obvious symptoms. What happens in your blood sugar and insulin signaling? Most people don't realize how strongly your morning routine can shape your entire day's metabolic curve. If you wake up and your first meal is high-carb, toast, cereal, sweet coffee drinks, you get a sharp glucose rise. Your pancreas answers with insulin. Then you crash. Then cravings return. Then you snack. Then insulin rises again. Over years, this pattern can push you toward insulin resistance. Now here's where cinnamon becomes interesting. At the molecular level, cinnamon contains compounds, often discussed in research as cinnamaldehyde and various polyphenols, that may influence glucose transport and insulin signaling pathways. The evidence suggests cinnamon can help improve insulin sensitivity in some people, meaning your cells respond more efficiently to insulin's message. And that matters because insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. It's a master storage signal. Higher insulin tends to push more energy into storage and makes fat release harder. Lower, calmer insulin signaling tends to make fat burning more accessible between meals. So what might happen if cinnamon water becomes your consistent morning input? For some people, especially those with pre-diabetes or metabolic syndrome tendencies, you may see a flatter glucose curve, fewer sharp spikes, fewer deep crashes, and fewer urgent cravings later in the day. Not magic, signaling. And when you repeat that daily, you're not just managing one morning, you're shaping the pattern your metabolism lives in. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. The craving effect, why people feel less hungry. One of the most common reports from people who start cinnamon water is, "I'm not as hungry," or "I snack less." A lot of people assume that's placebo. Sometimes it's not. Here's the mechanism that makes sense biologically. When glucose rises sharply, it often falls sharply. That fall can feel like hunger, irritability, shakiness, or a sudden need for sugar. When the glucose curve is smoother, your brain receives fewer emergency fuel signals. Also, cinnamon's aroma and taste can psychologically reduce the desire for sweet flavors because it gives you a sense of sweetness without sugar. But the deeper point is metabolic. Stable glucose can reduce cravings, lower impulsive snacking, improve energy steadiness, and make intermittent fasting windows easier to tolerate for some people. One morning drink can't override a poor diet, but it can change your starting point. Inflammation, inflammaging, and why it matters. After 50, aging isn't just time passing. Biologically, aging is strongly tied to accumulated cellular stress, oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, and chronic low-grade inflammation. Researchers sometimes call this chronic inflammation inflammaging because it quietly accelerates many conditions linked to aging: cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, joint issues, cognitive decline, and slower recovery. Cinnamon contains bioactive compounds that may modulate inflammatory pathways. You'll often hear research discussions around pathways like NF-κB, which acts like a switchboard for inflammatory gene expression. The evidence suggests cinnamon can reduce certain inflammatory signals in some contexts. That doesn't mean it's a cure for inflammatory disease. It means it may nudge the internal environment toward calmer signaling, and if you're over 50, that matters more than ever because your body's baseline inflammatory tone tends to rise with age, stress, sleep disruption, and metabolic dysfunction. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Mitochondria, energy, and the quiet upgrade. People notice. If you've ever felt like your energy isn't what it used to be, it's not always motivation. Sometimes it's mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy factories inside your cells. They convert food into ATP, the usable energy your tissues run on. When mitochondria become less efficient, you may experience fatigue, brain fog, slower recovery, and reduced metabolic flexibility. Here's what's interesting. Poor glucose control and chronic inflammation both damage mitochondrial function over time. It becomes a loop. Cinnamon may help break part of that loop indirectly by stabilizing glucose and reducing oxidative stress load. Some research also discusses cinnamon's potential influence on AMPK, a cellular energy sensing pathway linked to repair, metabolic efficiency, and mitochondrial health. AMPK is often activated by fasting, exercise, and energy stress. Cinnamon isn't fasting, but it may provide a mild signal that supports better metabolic regulation, especially in people who can't do intense exercise or long fasts consistently. If mitochondria work cleaner, you often feel it as steadier energy, not a caffeine spike. A calmer engine. The belly fat conversation, why it's not just calories. People want cinnamon water for belly fat, but belly fat is rarely just a calorie issue. Stubborn abdominal fat is strongly linked to insulin resistance, cortisol dysregulation, poor sleep, and chronic inflammation. When insulin is frequently high, the body tends to store more energy, especially centrally. So if cinnamon water helps improve insulin sensitivity and reduces glucose volatility, it may indirectly support fat loss, especially in the abdominal region where insulin resistance is often most visible. But I want to say this clearly, cinnamon water is not a fat-burning drug. It tends to work best as a metabolic stabilizer, and stabilizers are powerful over time. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Who benefits most, and why older adults often feel it more? If you're 25, metabolically healthy and physically active, cinnamon water might be pleasant but subtle. If you're over 50 or you've noticed your waistline expanding despite eating, similar, post-meal sleepiness, cravings that feel stronger than they used to, blood work trending toward prediabetes, or energy that crashes mid-morning, then cinnamon water may feel disproportionately helpful. Because after 50, your metabolic margin is smaller. Your body is less forgiving of big glucose swings. Your muscle mass tends to decline, and muscle is your largest glucose sink, and your inflammatory baseline often rises. So a gentle daily intervention that nudges glucose control, reduces inflammatory tone, and supports metabolic signaling can have bigger perceived effects. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. The common mistake, do this wrong and you lose the benefit. This is where most people get it wrong, so stay with me. Because the next part is where cinnamon water goes from helpful to pointless, and in some cases potentially risky. The mistake is thinking more is better. People overdo cinnamon. They use huge amounts daily. They don't consider the type of cinnamon, and they combine it with medications without thinking about interactions. The goal is not mega dosing. The goal is consistent, moderate signaling, daily, sustainable, and safe. How to do it safely: simple, affordable, realistic. A practical, conservative approach looks like this. Use a small amount consistently. Many people use around half a teaspoon of cinnamon in warm water, though individual tolerance varies. Start lower if you're sensitive. Make it a ritual, not a punishment. Warm water tends to extract flavor better and feels easier on digestion than cold water. Consider timing. Many people do it before breakfast because the goal is to influence the day's glucose curve early. Others do it before a carb-heavy meal. And here's an important nuance. Cinnamon water is often more effective when the rest of the morning supports metabolic stability, protein at breakfast, movement after eating, adequate sleep. Synergy matters. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. The cinnamon type issue, a safety detail most videos skip. There are different types of cinnamon commonly sold. One of the most discussed distinctions is between cassia cinnamon and Ceylon cinnamon. Cassia is common and inexpensive, but it can contain higher levels of a natural compound called coumarin, which in very high intake may be a concern for the liver in susceptible individuals. This doesn't mean cassia is toxic. It means chronic high dosing is not wise. If you plan to use cinnamon daily long-term, many people prefer Ceylon because it tends to be lower in coumarin. If you're using cassia, moderation becomes even more important. Again, the benefit is in consistency, not excess. Who should be cautious or avoid daily cinnamon water? Let's be practical and balanced. Cinnamon is natural, but natural doesn't mean risk-free, especially if you have certain conditions. You should be cautious and consider speaking with a qualified clinician if you take blood sugar-lowering medication for diabetes or prediabetes. Cinnamon may further lower glucose in some people, increasing the risk of hypoglycemia, especially if you're not monitoring. You have liver disease or a history of elevated liver enzymes. This is where chronic high intake, especially of coumarin-rich cinnamon, may not be appropriate. You take blood thinners or have a bleeding disorder. Cinnamon may have mild effects on blood clotting in some contexts, so caution is reasonable. You are pregnant or breastfeeding. Not because small culinary amounts are typically an issue, but because daily concentrated use isn't the same as occasional spice use. You have frequent heartburn or gastritis. Cinnamon water can irritate some stomachs, especially if taken on an empty stomach in high concentration. This isn't fear, it's respect for physiology. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects, but only if they're safe enough to sustain. What you can realistically expect, no miracle claims. So what happens to your body when you drink cinnamon water every morning? If it works well for you, the changes tend to be subtle at first, then clearer over weeks. More stable morning energy, fewer cravings and less snacking pressure, improved post-meal comfort and less crash, better consistency with weight control habits, a gradual trend toward improved insulin sensitivity markers in some individuals, potentially reduced inflammatory tone over time, and perhaps the most underrated effect, when your morning ritual supports metabolic calm, you make better decisions all day. Your brain isn't fighting cravings. Your body isn't surfing glucose waves. Your energy doesn't feel chaotic. That's when long-term change becomes possible. Small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Final takeaways. Cinnamon water isn't a detox miracle. It's a metabolic signal. Used consistently and moderately, it may help stabilize blood sugar, improve insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation, support mitochondrial efficiency, and make healthy routines easier, especially if you're over 50 and noticing that your metabolism has become less forgiving. The real power is not the cinnamon, it's the repetition. A small daily input applied for months can reshape your internal environment in a way that feels like your body is finally working with you again, not against you. If you want more evidence-flavored, practical longevity breakdowns like this, simple habits explained through real biology, consider subscribing. I'll keep these videos focused, grounded, and useful so you can build health that actually compounds over time.